You know, I often think about when Steam came around and brought about a marketable, widespread distribution form for video games about 15 years ago. It ushered in this golden age for indie developers. But at the same time, this sudden surge of small team, hyper-creative projects, it reminded me of a time way back. I'm talking about the times of Amstrad, Amiga, and Atari. Because digital distribution, for the first time in like over a decade, had established the conditions, or market conditions I should specify, that made it possible for small, independent teams of just a handful of people to make games completely on their own that would leave a mark on video game history. But Steam, as this glorified holy land for indie devs, has long become a shark tank for exactly those indies that made the platform into what it is today. These days it's become so overflooded with cheap asset flips, cash grabs, and shovelware that the seriously passionate, hard-working, dedicated indie developers often get completely buried and suffocated in it. Passionate creators of content that get choked by a greedy, incompetent algorithm which favors disposable quantity over quality? It does ring a bell, I really don't know. The indies ain't got it easy these days, and with Steam soon shifting a lot of their energy on a massive kaiju battle with the Tencent-owned Epic Store, I really don't see any of the big fish give a fundamental shit about the really small developers in the near future. So why don't we shift our focus a little bit away from the oligarchs and shine a little more light into the corners where indies are still cherished and embraced? I'm talking about places by indies for indies, like Itch.io, where developers can find a far more conductive and fertile environment for their games and get a far more decent cut of the earnings on top of that. So this is what this new mini video side series on my channel is going to be about, showcasing interesting games off the radar and signaling boost to small independent developers. So for this first, let's call it a pilot episode, I decided the theme to be horror, eldritch, gothic. 4 overlooked gems that all share a penchant for the dark and the macabre. But speaking of Atari, or rather of the Atari 2600, what if you, as a developer, impose on yourself the technical limitations of a console like the Atari 2600 and then attempted to make a truly scary, atmospheric horror games within these limitations? Now you could argue that the stone-cold classic Haunted House from 1982 already did that by making the player only see within the radius of a small candle that you have to light in order to see, but Airdorf's Faith shows how much more efficient and haunting an Atari 2600 horror game could have really been if they just would have done it like that back then. Faith is an Atari 2600 inspired horror adventure game in which the player takes on the role of a priest sometime in the 1980s who drives out to rural Connecticut to perform an unsanctioned exorcism on a girl that's allegedly possessed by a demon. The setting, despite, or maybe even because, being rendered in this extremely crude early 80s pixel art style, oozes atmosphere from the moment your car drives along the highway and you hear a violently bit-crushed Moonlight Sonata blare out of your speakers. Now to be fair, this game isn't really placed under the same technical limitations as an actual Atari 2600 cartridge. Like, that would give it only about 32 kilobytes of storage capacity to begin with. But through the minimalist and restrictive use of graphics, sound, the sluggish controls, and deliberately limited frame rate, Faith successfully establishes the feeling of a genuine classic game from that era that you maybe accidentally found in your desk drawer, covered in a thick layer of dust, and that you for some reason have never played before. And like many great horror titles, it is the limitations that make this game so effective. Faith orchestrates some truly intimidating moments in its short, maybe 1 to 2 hour long playtime. A lot of it comes from its excellent pacing and even more impressive sound design. For instance, there's this possessed creature roaming the woods around the remote mansion that seriously makes you jump in your seat if you don't watch out. And not in a cheap jump-scary way, but through its abject and uncanny visual and acoustic design. And once you enter the Martin family mansion and begin your exorcism of Amy through several stages of infestation, all of that across 2 stories, basement and attic of the house, you can feel that there's some serious thought and love put into every inch of how Faith stages this demonic encounter. And something that Faith makes crystal clear is how conductive the efficient use of the spoken or written word can be for a horror game. Spoken dialogue in this game is realized through heavily bit-crushed synthetic voice samples that add an extra layer of unease.
What I am about to do has not been approved by the Vatican.
The various bits of text scattered around in the form of newspaper articles, diary entries, letters, and so on you can find, I found them surprisingly well written. They give the whole story exactly enough context to flesh it out and turn this 8-bit tale into a thoroughly charming and haunting nightmare experience. And besides all this creepy goodness, Faith has the sense to not take itself too seriously all the time, which would make it cringy, but it's not. It's filled with lots of loving, tongue-in-cheek gimmicks and remarks that glues it all together into one dense, charming package. Making your audience laugh and smile, after all, has always been the best way to get them closer to your world and characters.
More of this.
It really makes me think, man, if this game would have been released back in the olden days for the Atari 2600, like in the early 80s, the satanic panic would have escalated to unparalleled heights. This would have been the exact game our parents kept warning us about. Like, it would have made the news so much that we wouldn't have heard anything but Faith for months to come. And man, we would have eaten that shit up. Y'all. Anyway, Faith is completely free on itch.io, but you can get the deluxe version with additional content and bonus goodies for as little as $1. Plus, Airdorf has just released Faith Chapter 2, which, as the title suggests, brings a whole new chapter to the story of the tragic events around Amy's exorcism, but it's also a lot more than that. It's in many ways a continuation and extension of the first game, and it shows that Airdorf's formula has somehow matured past the infant stages with Faith Chapter 2. This one is also available for $1 on itch. So what are you waiting for? You should go and play it. Unless you really don't want to.
You really don't want me to play, huh?
No, I do. Captain Howdy said no.
For now, let's stay in the 8-bit lane and go even a little bit further back in time, to the legendary Apple II. Or rather, to a game whose aesthetic is strongly inspired by the monochromatic days of the Apple II. For those who know my channel and also know my fondness for Junji Ito, this next game will hardly come as a surprise, because World of Horror is a 1-bit love letter to the unmatchable style and horror of Junji Ito. The game, conceived by the Polish developer Panstas, feels like it's lifted straight out of Uzumaki or Amigar Fault, set in an unnamed Japanese coastal town in the year 1980X, seasoned with a good pinch of straight-up Lovecraft. Its artworks and intricate menu designs hark back to the era of PC 9800 visual novels and eroge of Japan's 80s. I gotta admit that when I played the game for the first time, it took me a bit to grasp how it's actually played, or to even understand the genre. World of Horror plays a lot like a hybrid between a role-playing game, and by that I mean a tabletop session where you have like a game master that leads you through the story, and a board game. If you have played classic Lovecraft board games like Arkham Horror or Eldritch Horror, this is very close to that, and I'm sure World of Horror drew a lot of inspiration from them. And just like these board games, World of Horror is also designed with a bit of modularity in mind. Before you begin, and once you've picked one of a good handful of retro-aesthetic monochromatic color schemes in the main menu, you pick the packages or modules for a game session. Then you choose one of several stories with different protagonists to play. One tale is about a student photographer who stays late at school to investigate the mysterious disappearance of a friend. Another is about an aspiring idol visiting her friends in a remote village during a mysterious festival. Or another one is about a transfer student. What else? Racing against time to save her friend from a mysterious bet. You pick the story of your choice and then you go and investigate the mystery. Well, before that, you actually have to, just like in the Lovecraft board games, pick one of several ancient gods who will be slumbering and potentially awakening during your story if the terror meter fills up. Your choice will have different penalties on various gameplay elements, like decreasing your sanity whenever your character rests and stuff like that. The actual investigation is played out in a turn-based fashion. Your character features a set of stats such as strength, dexterity, intelligence, and carries an inventory full of items and weapons around, or can learn spells. And you have two vital resources: stamina, which is your life energy, and sanity. Several times a day, you choose a location on your map and play out random, or sometimes at critical moments, scripted story events. It's like drawing from a deck of cards. Let's say you decide to investigate the village, and the game draws the card Curious Bookstore for you. You have now the option to buy a magic item in that store, or a spell, both of which would be another random card draw and then add it to your inventory. Or you just leave it and save some funds. Sometimes events are just played out without your interaction and have an effect on your stats or inventory, for instance, like a man coming up to you and handing you a mysterious package. Another time you might find curious remains of an activity that you can investigate, and if you pass a certain stat check, you will get vital information, an item, or maybe experience points. It really plays like one of these RPG-light board games, and through its modular structure and with a healthy dash of narrative suspension of disbelief, meaning if you're able to let the story unfold in your mind and are ready to fill in the blanks, it allows for some phenomenal Eldritch horror storytelling. In the 10-12 rounds I played while recording this game, I've had several really interesting, almost spine-chilling encounters. Like, I'm a sucker for these board games, and whenever I played them with friends, I kept thinking how well this format would actually work as a video game. Imagine my excitement when I found this jewel, which is doing exactly that, but with Junji Ito. It's gorgeous, it oozes atmosphere, replayability, and potential for much, much more, if the author hopefully finds time for it at some point. World of Horror is free to download on itch.io, and the creator has set up a Patreon page to support the gradual expansion of the game with more Eldritch goodness content. Puppet Combo is pure hauntology in video game form. It's a developer that draws distinct and open inspiration from 1980s VHS and Betamax horror films, classic pulp slasher movies, and retro low-poly survival horror games, and blends these elements together whimsically to create something that's truly mesmerizing. When you hear names like Power Drill Massacre, Babysitter Bloodbath, or Night of the Nun, aka The Nun Massacre, you immediately get a sense of what's expecting you. A carpenter fever dream turned up to 11. Their most recent release, The Glass Staircase, is a haunting and spine-chilling homage to the pulpy genre of Italian splatter films of the 70s, wrapped in a package that lovingly tips its hat to the golden era of PS2 survival horror. The story takes place in a mysterious, dilapidated mansion where a bunch of maidens in white dresses are, apparently, held captive in a large dormitory. And every day, one girl gets announced through the speaker system to be chosen to be released. Skulking through the lonely and abandoned manor and its garden, reading notes and letters and exploring all its nooks and crannies while trying to get a grasp of what's actually going on here, it feels like a perfect marriage between Silent Hill 2 and 3 and the original Resident Evil in so many ways. You will quickly uncover that there is an evil presence roaming in this house and that you're everything but safe. I'm gonna keep it as spoiler-free as I can, but you're gonna uncover some sinister and eldritch secrets buried in the catacombs beneath the mansion and soon face monsters, evil cultists, and the curse of the living dead unleashed upon you. It's a genuinely charming pastiche of tropes that doesn't always take itself too terribly seriously all the times, but just like the glorious zombie films it pays homage to, it can be pretty spine-chilling and terrifying, especially since you're the one playing it. The Glass Staircase has a really unusual pacing. It feels like it's hand-holding you almost casually for a guided tour of suspense and horror tropes for a good while, with very little actual challenge, until it suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, unleashes pure hell on you. Almost literally. I'm sure you'd never get quite like this in a Resident Evil or The Evil Within, and you know what? That is good. That's exactly what makes games like this stand out. Good horror games need to achieve exactly this, to lead you on thin ice and then pull you deep under, to invoke a serious feeling of disempowerment. Now, a little warning out here. The game features a small handful of loud jump scares that I would personally definitely put in the category of cheap screamer, that I feel the game could also just as well do without. So if you enjoy that stuff, cool, but if you're more sensitive to it, ye be warned. And Puppet Combo, as in all their games, lay it on thick. These games, stylistically, are not subtle, and in their case that's not a bad thing, quite the contrary. The opulent use of filters, post-processing effects, references almost shamelessly lifted from the works it takes influence from, style, aesthetic, sound, animation, it fucking works. It guiltlessly blares out the developer's love for nostalgia without any obfuscation. You can feel that these games are made not just for the audience but for the maker themselves. This is the ultimate form of fan art, because its unique blend of hauntological elements gives it soul and originality. And to make that clear, it's not just style over substance. There are elements about the Glass Staircase that genuinely enthralled me, and considering the tiny studio's ultra-fast turnaround, are incredibly well designed. My favorite example in this game is the control scheme, since it feels like it comes around with a fantastic solution for the age-old fixed camera / tank controls genre. Think of Resident Evil 1 HD Remaster. It delivers two different types of controls. The classic tank controls, meaning you can only turn your character by rotating them with directional keys, or the modern controls, which completely change the control scheme to a camera relative input to make it more quote-unquote intuitive and direct. But honestly, I think tank controls are something that just belongs to this very particular genre. The sluggishness of the characters, embedded in the game's overall level, enemy, and item design can just make or break the game. It goes back to the aspect I mentioned earlier when talking about Airdorf, that limitations are in many cases what makes a horror experience shine. The Glass Staircase also offers both, the traditional tank controls and a more approachable variant of it that I find damn near perfect. Basically, if you play with keyboard and mouse, you use the mouse to simply rotate your character while the arrow keys or WSD make her move. If you're aiming your weapon, a tiny, stylishly red glowing crosshair gets projected to where it goes boom. And man, this just works like magic. It feels like an elegant hybrid between a top-down shooter a la Hotline Miami, which is direct, fast, and intuitive, while still remaining a tank-controlled character that pivots around an imaginary vertical axis. What struck me about it is that it practically fully delivers both intuitiveness and approachability and the feeling of a bulky, sluggish, tank-controlled character. I think this solution has a lot of potential for future survival horror titles even. The Glass Staircase, with its 3 to 4 hour long story arc and its almost charming lack of pristine AAA grade polish, abundantly filled with seams and sharp edges everywhere, has gotten me more intensely excited than most of the hyper-polished monster-budget AAA titles I've played in recent years. To me, this game has a super impressive, awesome per minute ratio compared to so many games out there that rather stretch themselves thin. The Glass Staircase is also available on itch.io at the time of release of this video for around $6, and my advice to you is that you should get it and support the developer.
Okay, I'll take your advice.
Now for the last game of today's video, I want to share a visual novel. And there's a lot of visual novel that I would love to share, and I hope I get to that at some point. But today let's start with one that really took me by surprise. Now if the name Carmilla makes you immediately think of Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 vampire novel that famously predated Dracula by over a quarter of a century, then you're on the money, because that's exactly what visual Gothic's Carmilla is all about. It's a very cleverly and lovingly realized visual novel adaptation of Le Fanu's iconic vampire tale. Carmilla is clever because it doesn't just simply take the original text and slap a bit of art on top of it, but it transubstantiates the source material with a keen sense for its emotional essence, what made and still makes Le Fanu's novella work so well after 1.5 centuries, and faithfully translates it into an audio-visual medium. I suspect a lot of it comes from the openly stated philosophy behind the developer Visual Gothic's approach for this project. To paraphrase the author, a feeling for the duality that is inherent in the definitions of the term visual and Gothic, the interplay between scientific and the supernatural, fact and fiction, and the relation between the tangible and intangible. It's lovingly made because it combines some truly remarkable artwork with a lot of attention to detail, animations aplenty, illustrations, little effects here and there, and nuances everywhere from start to finish. Even many high-budget visual novels from the heart of Japan don't bother this much with polish and care for pretty much every scene and screen. Oftentimes, they just animate and illustrate the necessary and present large parts of the story dump with plain character drawings and still backgrounds for vast stretches of time. Carmilla doesn't do that. This game is ripe with variation, detail, animation, and many little loving flourishes that make it really come to life. You'll instantly know what I mean when you play it. This game radiates passion for the story it wants to tell and uses every chance to convey it. True to the novella, the story is told from the perspective of the protagonist Laura, a teenage girl growing up and living in the idyllic, picturesque, but solitary castle of her aristocratic father amid an extensive forest in Styria, Austria. One day, a carriage accident outside Laura's home unexpectedly brings a girl of her age into the family's care. Her name is Carmilla, and the two girls quickly become friends and develop a fondness towards each other that goes beyond just a platonic friendship. The thing that's pretty much always put up front when Carmilla is mentioned is that lesbian vampire story. And yeah, this is true. The story famously features the depiction of a romance between two women, one of them happening to be a vampire, but this portrayal also reduces the tale to its most obvious element. Many adaptations of the work focused very blatantly on this aspect in an exploitative manner, like the classic Hammer film The Vampire Lovers from 1970, which I love, but I love it as a piece of pulp entertainment. It deliberately and provocatively overemphasizes the purely sexual aspect of the tale and turns it into gaze erotica. Carmilla, the visual novel, and that's what I ultimately love most about it, exerts its eroticism through subtle suggestiveness alone, and focuses its emotional energy on the romantic and the human tones of the story. A story, at its heart, about two girls who find a bond through extreme loneliness brought about by their circumstances. And I was honestly so positively surprised to find such a non-exploitative, tasteful adaptation of this novella that sheds a light on the empathetic aspects of the source material, explicitly among the genre of visual novels that can so often be ripe with fan service over substance. I guess you just have to come to the right fandom, huh? Another thing that I find thoroughly enjoyable about Carmilla is how well the somewhat antiquated language of late 19th century Gothic fiction actually works in a visual novel. Because the VN straight up lifts large parts directly off the original novella. When I started playing, some of the slightly archaic phrasings of Le Fanu's prose felt initially weirdly out of place, but it quickly began to feel refreshingly unconventional. And after a while, it really started working. It brings a degree of authenticity that is hard to achieve by trying to imitate fancy old-sounding language manually. Carmilla is, to my estimate, a good 4 to 5 hours long, but I'm a rather slow reader, so I guess you just gotta see for yourself. And once again, it's completely free on itch.io. Now, the opening sequence that frames the story into a collection of manuscripts told from the perspective of a team of occult detectives working on a popular scientific magazine of occult tales, it might suggest that Carmilla is only one of several tales. So I sincerely hope that Visual Gothic, both the game developer and the eponymous in-universe publication, might at some point bless us with more adventures from the Gothic era in the future. I mean, there's so many great stories in the public domain that would work in the same format, so I would certainly welcome it with open arms and an open bedroom window. Sounded weird. Now, a final note. Most of the games that I show today are completely free. When you get them on itch.io, get the option to download them directly or leave a little tip for the developer. And I'd actually like to encourage you to do that, to leave a little tip. If one of the games that I showed today has managed to pique your curiosity enough to get you to buy them, consider that the developers who put them out there for free have spent hundreds of hours to make them, and in that have already succeeded in catching your attention. So giving a tip of about $1 is less than a cup of coffee, but it also says, hey, I appreciate your work, and I let my wallet speak for it. And finally, about this new series here on my channel, Games from Underground, I've been considering doing a low-key video series, giving a little bit of a platform to indie developers for quite some time, and I'm happy that I finally got around to do it. There are many, many games, like this is just a tiny selection. I chose to do a horror-themed first pilot episode, and I could have immediately done 4 or 5 just horror-themed videos, and I've got a couple of other themes, queued as well. So I'm really excited for this because there's a lot to cover and there's a lot of great stuff out there that nearly doesn't get as much attention as it deserves. And I'm also asking for your feedback here a little bit. Like, this first episode doesn't have to be nailed to the wall. Like, we can evolve it from here into something that makes the most sense. So what would you like to see in this series and where would you like it to go? Let me know, and most importantly, show me indie games. Show me games that you think are fallen under the radar and that deserve way more attention than they get. And especially if you're a developer, feel free to plug your own work. I'm gonna greenlight all the comments that, do a little bit of self-advertisement, because most places on the internet really frown upon self-advertisement, and it is hard enough to get your stuff out there. So if you have a passionate project you're working on, if it's finished, if it's in development, whatever, feel free to shout it out and feel free to send it to me, either here in the comments or on my Twitter, for instance. I don't have a massive platform, but I want to try and give a little bit of boost to smaller developers with whatever I can. So let's work together here. I'm really excited for this. I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, ta-da!